Now that we know how you can actually go ahead, create a view and associate that view with the URL pattern, let's actually learn how Django URL pattern actually works. So let's understand the internal working, because when you go ahead and understand internal working of how Django exactly works when it receives a user request, you will be able to learn Django in a much more better way, and you will have an in-depth understanding of the subject instead of just scratching the surface. So let's go ahead and learn how exactly Django works. So what Django does is that Django actually looks for the incoming request, and when it receives an incoming request, first of all, it looks for something which is called as the root URL conf. And this variable is actually located in the settings.py file. So right now, if you open up your website or if you open up your web project, you will have a file which is called as settings.py file. And in that particular file, if you search for the root underscore URL conf variable, you will have a variable over there. And in there, as you can see, that particular variable currently points to the mysite.urls file. So that means Django now tells that whenever there is some incoming user request, that is whenever a user is entering some sort of an URL, what Django needs to do is that Django first needs to go and look for the root URL configuration. So now as the root URL configuration points to mysite.urls, Django now needs to go ahead and look for the URL patterns inside this particular file. So after that, Django actually goes to the urls.py file, and when it goes to the urls.py file, it's going to compare the URL patterns which are present in the urls.py file, which is nothing but the mysite.urls file. So it's going to compare the request which was sent by the user to the URL patterns which are present in this urls.py file. And when it finds that there is a match of a particular pattern with the incoming request, it's simply going to go ahead and call that particular view which is associated with that particular URL pattern. Now, if this sounds confusing to you, let's go ahead and take an example. So as an example, we will take the example which we have completed in the previous lecture, wherein we have one view associated with a particular URL. So in the previous lecture, what we had done is that we had entered this particular URL, that is /food/hello, into the URL bar. And now let's understand how Django works from here. So now when we enter that particular URL, first of all, Django looks for the root URL conf variable, and it's going to see that variable from the settings.py file. And as you can see, this actually points to the site which is mysite.urls. So now Django knows it has to look for the URL patterns in the mysite.urls file. So it's going to open up that file, and it's going to find that the URL patterns which are present over here, and now it's going to match this particular request which is /food/hello with these patterns right here. So first of all, it's going to check for this pattern. So admin does not match up with food, so it's going to skip that. Then it's going to move on to the next path, which is this food right over here. And now it's going to find out that, okay, this part actually matches up with this particular part right here. And henceforth, it's going to see what's next. So the next thing which it notices is that we have included another urls.py file, which is food.urls. So then it's going to jump on to that particular file, which is food.urls. And upon going to this particular file, it's going to again look for that pattern and compare it with the user's entered request. So it's going to find that the request actually matches up with the pattern over here for this path. Henceforth, it's now going to go into the view, which is this view right here. And hence now Django understands that as user has requested this particular URL, it now needs to execute this view, which is nothing but the index view. So then it's going to load up the index view from the views.py file, which is this view right here, which is nothing but a plain simple function, and henceforth it's going to execute this particular function. So upon executing this function simply returns an HTTP response, which is hello world, and therefore we get hello world on our browser screen as an output. So this is how Django works internally. So whenever Django receives a user request, Django first of all looks for the root URL config variable, and then it finds out that that variable is going to point to a certain file which contains the URL patterns, then it's simply going to match up the URL pattern with the user request. And when it finds out that particular pattern present over here, then it's going to look for the view which it needs to load up, and then it's going to simply go ahead and execute that particular view, which is nothing but a Python function. So that's it for this lecture, and hopefully you guys be able to understand how Django works internally when you go ahead and type in some request inside the URL bar of your web browser. So that's it for this lecture. If you have any doubts or queries, feel free to post in the Q&A section and I will be there to help you out. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.